December 13th, 7:35 p.m. Abrar Ashraf. The first mistake happened long before a single word was spoken to him. It happened in the glances that lingered a second too long, in the tightened expressions of authority that decided his role without confirmation. Assumptions don't need evidence when bias is comfortable. The black executive took his seat like any other passenger, calm, well-dressed, carrying himself with quiet assurance. But to some eyes in that cabin, he didn't match the invisible picture they had already drawn of who belonged in that space. Before credentials, before context, before courtesy, judgment had already taken its seat beside him. When the issue arose, it wasn't investigated, it was presumed. The tone of the request carried more accusation than inquiry, more command than conversation. He noticed it immediately, the way his words were received not as information but as resistance. Every response he gave was filtered through an assumption that he was being difficult, that he was pushing boundaries he had no right to push. Others who raised concerns were treated as customers, but he was treated as a problem to be managed. The facts were irrelevant because the story had already been written in someone else's mind. Passengers nearby watched the exchange unfold, and many unconsciously joined in the assumption. Silence can be agreement when it's easier than questioning authority. Some avoided eye contact, others leaned back, content to let the moment pass without involvement. It's astonishing how quickly a crowd can accept a version of reality simply because it's presented confidently by someone in uniform. No one asked who he was, why he spoke the way he did, or whether the situation was being handled fairly. They assumed the airline must be right because airlines don't make mistakes like this, because systems are supposed to be neutral, because bias is easier to deny than confront. Inside that moment, the executive understood something deeply familiar. He had seen this pattern before in boardrooms and meetings, in subtle dismissals and overt challenges. The assumption that he must prove his legitimacy while others are granted it automatically. He knew that reacting emotionally would only feed the narrative being constructed about him. Every raised eyebrow, every clipped response from staff was an invitation to confirm their expectations. Instead, he chose restraint not because he was powerless, but because he was fully aware of the power dynamics at play. The staff believed they were enforcing rules, but rules without context become weapons. They spoke over him, not to him, repeating phrases that sounded rehearsed and final. He listened carefully, noticing how quickly professionalism gave way to impatience. What they didn't realize was that assumptions blind people to details that matter. They missed the way he articulated himself, the confidence in his posture, the precision of his language. These were not the traits of someone trying to disrupt a flight, but those details didn't fit the assumption, so they were ignored. Assumptions have momentum. Once set in motion, they pull everyone along with them. A supervisor was called, not to clarify, but to reinforce the initial judgment. Each new authority figure arrived already primed with a version of events that painted him as the issue. The truth had to fight uphill, against whispers passed quietly, against summaries stripped of nuance. It's easier to accept a flawed narrative than to admit the first call was wrong. Admitting error means confronting bias, and bias is most dangerous when it hides behind policy. The executive remained composed, but inside he was calculating. He understood that facts would matter eventually, but only if he could get them heard. He knew that this moment wasn't just about a seat or a disagreement. It was about how quickly society assigns roles based on appearance and how rarely those roles are questioned. Every second stretched as the situation escalated, fueled not by evidence, but by certainty that didn't come from truth. Around him, the cabin felt different now. Tension replaced indifference. Some passengers began to sense that something was off, that the confidence of the staff was beginning to crack under the weight of unanswered questions. Assumptions can control a situation only until reality demands attention. The executive waited, aware that the same system that rushed to judge him had also created records, hierarchies, and protocols that could not ignore him forever. He understood that when facts finally entered the conversation, they wouldn't just correct a misunderstanding, they would reveal how fragile those assumptions really were, how quickly authority can crumble when it's built on nothing more than belief instead of truth. What unfolded next was no longer about a misunderstanding, but about power being exercised without accountability. Authority has a way of disguising itself as order, especially when wrapped in policies that sound neutral on the surface. The airline staff spoke with rehearsed confidence, leaning on procedures that were never meant to override basic fairness. Their voices carried the weight of the company behind them, and in that moment, they believed that was enough. They weren't listening to resolve the issue, they were listening to respond, and that distinction changed everything. The executive noticed how quickly the language shifted. Words like policy, protocol, and procedure replaced dialogue. These terms were used as shields, not explanations. When he asked for clarification, the answers grew shorter, more rigid, as though repetition would somehow make the decision unquestionable. Authority, when misused, doesn't seek understanding, it seeks compliance. And compliance was what they expected from him, not conversation. The message was clear without being said aloud. This is not a discussion. What made the misuse of authority more dangerous was how invisible it seemed to those exercising it. They didn't see themselves as unfair or biased, only as employees doing their job. That self-perception allowed them to escalate the situation without reflection. Each step they took felt justified in their own minds because they were following a chain of command. Yet the chain itself was flawed, built on an initial assumption that was never challenged. Authority amplified that assumption instead of correcting it. The presence of uniforms, badges, and official language gave the impression of legitimacy. To onlookers, it appeared as though the airline was simply maintaining order. Very few questioned whether the order itself was just. Authority can silence dissent not through force, but through confidence. When someone speaks as though they cannot be wrong, others often accept it as truth. This is how institutions protect themselves, by making their decisions appear inevitable rather than chosen. The executive remained steady, but he recognized the strategy being used against him. By framing the issue as a rule violation, the staff shifted focus away from their own behavior. It was no longer about how he was being treated, but about how he was expected to respond. His calm was interpreted not as cooperation, but as defiance, because it did not fit the submissive response they anticipated. Authority often struggles with individuals who do not perform the role it assigns them. As the situation escalated, more layers of authority entered the scene. Each new voice carried the same script, reinforcing the original stance without adding clarity. This repetition created the illusion of consensus, as if multiple people agreeing made the decision correct. In reality, it only demonstrated how deeply the misuse of authority had spread. No one paused to ask whether the rule applied fairly, or whether the enforcement was proportional. The goal had shifted from resolving the issue to asserting control. Passengers could sense the imbalance, even if they couldn't name it. The exchange felt less like customer service and more like a demonstration of power. Authority, when unchecked, becomes performative. It seeks an audience, consciously or not, to validate itself. The staff's firm tones and rigid posture were not just for the executive, but for everyone watching. It was a reminder of who held power in that space and who was expected to yield to it. The most telling sign of misuse was the absence of empathy. At no point did anyone acknowledge how the situation looked or felt from his perspective. Authority had replaced humanity. The policies they cited became barriers, preventing them from seeing the person in front of them. When systems prioritize control over understanding, they lose their moral grounding. The executive understood that this was no longer about convincing them in the moment, but about allowing their actions to fully reveal themselves. Every instruction given, every refusal to listen, added another layer to the exposure of that misuse. Authority thrives in darkness, but it falters when illuminated. The airline staff believed they were closing ranks, protecting procedure, but in reality, they were documenting a failure of leadership in real time. The executive remained present, aware that the same authority attempting to silence him was also creating a record that could not be undone, one that showed how easily power can be abused when it is never questioned. The cabin was full, yet the moment felt isolating. Public spaces have a strange way of turning private injustice into a shared secret. Everyone can see it, but no one feels responsible for stopping it. As the exchange continued, the silence from those watching grew heavier than the words being spoken. People shifted in their seats, pretended to scroll on their phones, stared out the windows at nothing. Silence became the background noise that allowed everything else to continue uninterrupted. Most passengers told themselves a comforting story. "It's not my place. I don't know the full situation. The staff must have a reason." These thoughts created distance, a buffer that made inaction feel reasonable. Public silence rarely comes from cruelty. It comes from fear of being wrong, fear of being involved, fear of standing out. Yet its impact is the same. By saying nothing, the crowd unknowingly sided with the louder authority, reinforcing the idea that what was happening was acceptable. The executive felt the weight of that silence immediately. It wasn't just the staff who were treating him as an issue, it was the collective decision of the cabin to let it happen. He understood that many people were uncomfortable, that some even sympathized with him, but sympathy without action is invisible. Silence has a way of erasing nuance. To anyone observing later, it would look like consensus, as though everyone agreed with the treatment he was receiving. That is how public silence transforms into institutional support. In moments like this, injustice feeds on normalcy. The flight attendants continued their routine movements between firm instructions, reinforcing the illusion that everything was under control. The normal sounds of a flight, announcements, footsteps, the rustle of bags, all blended into a scene where something was clearly wrong, yet treated as ordinary. Silence allowed the abnormal to masquerade as procedure. The more routine it looked, the harder it became for anyone to interrupt it. Some passengers felt a quiet discomfort rising. They sensed a mismatch between the executive's calm demeanor and the severity of the response he was receiving. But doubt crept in quickly. What if they misunderstood? What if speaking up made things worse? Public settings amplify these fears because disagreement feels like confrontation, and confrontation feels risky. Silence, on the other hand, feels safe. It protects the individual at the cost of the person being singled out. The staff, consciously or not, drew strength from that quiet. With no voices challenging them, their confidence solidified. Silence can be mistaken for approval, especially by those already convinced of their authority. Each unspoken moment became a confirmation that they were in the right. The executive recognized this dynamic clearly. He knew that once a crowd chooses silence, reversing the narrative becomes more difficult. The absence of witnesses is as powerful as the presence of opponents. There is a particular loneliness that comes from being visible and ignored at the same time. The executive stood out yet felt erased. His experience was happening in full view, yet it was treated as though it were private, something not meant for intervention. Public silence does not deny the event, it simply refuses to engage with it. That refusal sends a message that dignity is conditional, and support is optional. As time passed, the tension in the cabin thickened. A few passengers began to exchange glances, subtle acknowledgments that something was off. Silence started to fracture, not with words, but with awareness. Awareness is the first crack in complicity. The executive sensed that shift, understanding that silence can hold only as long as doubt outweighs clarity. Once clarity begins to spread, silence becomes harder to maintain. Public silence is powerful, but it is also fragile. It depends on everyone believing that someone else will speak, or that speaking isn't necessary. The longer the situation continued, the more that belief was tested. The executive remained composed, knowing that the very stillness of the crowd was telling a story of its own, one that revealed how easily injustice can be normalized when no one claims responsibility to challenge it. There is a quiet strength in restraint that often goes unnoticed, especially in moments designed to provoke a reaction. The executive understood this well. While tension pressed in from every side, he did not raise his voice or mirror the aggression being directed at him. His calm was deliberate, a controlled response in a situation that demanded emotional intelligence more than volume. In a space where authority expected submission or conflict, he offered neither, and that alone disrupted the script. Bias often relies on predictable behavior. It anticipates anger, defensiveness, or retreat. When those expectations are not met, it becomes unstable. The executive's confidence did not come from posturing, but from certainty about who he was and what he had earned. He did not need to announce his accomplishments or demand respect. His posture, his tone, and his measured responses communicated something far more unsettling to those confronting him. He was not intimidated, and he was not confused. Every time he spoke, he chose precision over passion. He asked clear questions, repeated facts, and avoided language that could be twisted against him. This was not passivity, it was strategy. Calm confidence is often mistaken for weakness by those who equate power with loudness. The airline staff, expecting resistance or emotional escalation, struggled to categorize him. He did not fit the narrative they had assigned, and that dissonance exposed the bias underlying their assumptions. Institutional bias thrives when individuals conform to the roles expected of them. The executive refused to perform the role of the problem passenger. He did not beg for understanding or apologize for existing in that space. His refusal to internalize their judgment was a form of resistance. By remaining composed, he denied them the justification they needed to escalate further without scrutiny. Calm, in this context, became a mirror reflecting the imbalance of the situation back onto those enforcing it. As the exchange continued, the contrast grew sharper. The staff's voices hardened while his remained steady. Their impatience became visible. Their certainty began to fray. Calm confidence has a way of amplifying the emotional tone of others. The more controlled he was, the more excessive their responses appeared. This imbalance did not go unnoticed by those watching. Passengers who had remained silent earlier began to sense that the issue was not his behavior, but the reaction to it. The executive was aware of the optics. He knew that, in public conflicts, perception can be as powerful as fact. By maintaining composure, he allowed the situation to reveal itself without interference. He understood that emotional reactions often become the focus, distracting from the root problem. His calm kept attention where it belonged, on the actions of the airline and the way authority was being exercised. This awareness gave him an advantage that could not be taken away. Bias loses strength when confronted with dignity. The executive's confidence was not loud, but it was unmistakable. It challenged the assumption that he needed to prove his worth under pressure. Each measured response reaffirmed his self-assurance and exposed the insecurity behind the attempts to control him. The more the staff insisted on their authority, the more it became clear that authority without fairness is fragile. This dynamic began to shift the energy in the cabin. Calm has a way of spreading, just as tension does. Some passengers straightened in their seats, listening more closely. The executive's demeanor created space for others to question what they were seeing. When someone remains composed under unjust pressure, it invites observers to reassess their initial assumptions. Confidence, when rooted in self-respect, can quietly dismantle bias without a single confrontation. In choosing calm over confrontation, the executive reclaimed control of the moment. He did not need to overpower anyone to assert his presence. His confidence stood in contrast to the institutional bias he faced, revealing that true authority does not come from uniforms or policies, but from the ability to remain grounded when everything around you is designed to unsettle you. The turning point did not arrive with an announcement or an apology. It arrived quietly, through facts that could no longer be bent to fit the story that had been constructed. Narratives are powerful when they go unchallenged, but they are fragile when exposed to truth. Up until that moment, the airline's version of events had relied on confidence and repetition. Once verifiable details entered the space, that confidence began to crack. The executive had waited patiently for this shift. He understood that truth rarely shouts its way into authority. It waits for the right opening. When documentation was requested, when names and roles were clarified, the narrative that painted him as the problem started to lose its grip. What had been framed as a compliance issue suddenly looked like a misjudgment. The same staff who spoke with certainty moments earlier now hesitated, their words slowing as they recalculated their position. Truth has weight because it does not depend on belief. Unlike assumptions, it does not require agreement to exist. As facts surfaced, the story the airline had been telling no longer aligned with reality. Small inconsistencies became visible. Timelines didn't match. Policies were selectively applied. The confidence that once silenced questions now invited them. Each unanswered detail weakened the authority of the narrative that had been imposed on him. Passengers sensed the shift almost immediately. The energy in the cabin changed as people leaned in, paying closer attention. What once felt like a one-sided enforcement now appeared uncertain. Truth disrupts comfort, especially for those who benefited from the earlier version of events. Some staff members avoided eye contact. Others deferred decisions they had previously made without hesitation. The story was no longer theirs to control. The executive did not celebrate this moment outwardly. He remained composed, aware that truth speaks most clearly when it is allowed to stand on its own. Ian,